Hey folks, welcome back to the Wisdom Nutrition Podcast. This is Alex Sakin, and today I'm going to be analyzing a few clips from two recent appearances by Colonel Douglas MacGregor, who first appeared on Tucker Carlson and then also on the Redacted program, which is a news program on YouTube. And he gives the best analysis I've seen of what the implications are for this current situation in Israel. And just so you know, I'm recording this on October 26th. And so we're at a critical moment in time with this escalation where we haven't yet had the ground attack on Gaza, but we've had 2 weeks of just carpet bombing of Gaza. Thousands and thousands of Gazan civilians have been killed, many children, and the images of this are all over the internet. And this is serving to infuriate the larger Islamic world and to ultimately, it looks like, draw them into a war with Israel. And it seems that Israel is almost deliberately provoking this because the way that they're acting, the retribution is sort of perfectly designed almost to unite the Islamic world against them, and to force their hand in terms of attacking Israel and stopping this assault on Gaza, because nothing, it seems, is going to stop this. And ultimately, the way I look at Israel, it's really a vassal state of the U.S. empire. And the government in Israel is a sort of crony government, just like the Zelensky government in Ukraine is a crony government, and many governments around the world. So this is a critical time, and I think Colonel MacGregor gives some of the best analysis you'll see at the moment. So I want to talk about some of what he said. I'm also going to reference a couple clips from Bret Weinstein of the Dark Horse podcast, who gives some analysis of the original terrorist attack on Israel on October 7th by Hamas. And that is really a key part of this story because it helps us unpack maybe what's going on here in terms of some of the issues that are revealed when you look into this October 7th attack. So I want to start off here by looking at a clip from Colonel MacGregor. This is from his appearance on the Redacted program. And let's hear what he says about the idea that the U.S., perhaps through Israel, is looking to start a larger regional war, perhaps with the goal of ultimately drawing Russia in to support Iran when Iran would be inevitably drawn into these conflicts with Lebanon and potentially Egypt. So we're going to be investigating these topics in this episode. So let's kick it off.
It looks as though the same people controlling events in Jerusalem are controlling events in Washington, and they are unanimous in their desire for a major war. And I don't think people understand the implications. We need to understand that however much we hate Hamas, taking the current approach is the road to Armageddon in the Middle East. So this has the ingredients in it for a very major war. Now we're escalating across the boards. We seem to think that escalation works. We've tried that in Ukraine, and today Ukraine is in ruins. My great fear is that if this regional war unfolds as I think it might, there may be no Israel at the end of it. We are in a position to somehow or another address that and move this out of the realm of inevitable regional war into something more manageable. But there doesn't seem to be any interest in doing so.
So why would there not be any interest in doing so? Like, why is the American sort of national security state and the whole neocon apparatus moving full force into support of this conflict, given the implications in terms of a larger war? And it seems like all along, the U.S. has been wanting a war with Iran many decades, going back to the project of a new American century around the time of 9/11. And so it makes sense that America could be driving this towards a world conflict, because it's hard to know what the grand strategy of America is in terms of what it wants for its empire in the future. I mean, I have my own thoughts. I've shared those in some of my past episodes, and I'll touch on it some more towards the end here. But I mean, the picture that we're seeing is the fact that U.S. empire around the world, Israel's a vassal state. The U.S. is supporting this military-industrial buildup of Israel, but it's also supporting a government that has these Zionistic policies, these very racial policies that are against the spirit of America, but they are very valuable for antagonizing and destabilizing the Middle East in general, the Islamic countries around the Middle East. And, the U.S. empire is also tinkering and manipulating each of these countries on its own. And, playing sides against each other, financing these totalitarian government regimes, which are very harsh over the people, rule with an iron fist, and promote a very orthodox brand of Islamicism. So we do that, but then we also fund the terrorist groups that these governments are fighting against. So we're supplying both sides and we're keeping everything unstable. And that helps the petrodollar, this petrodollar system, the U.S. financial system, which is the backbone of its global empire, and the linkages of that dollar system to oil is really how the whole thing is like this. It's like the skeleton of how this global economic financial empire works. And so this is it's always been from the very beginning, it's been a key aspect of U.S. foreign policy to set the system up, but also to continuously destabilize the Middle East in order to keep it from uniting together, nationalizing and socializing the oil resources, and pushing out this global imperial system. So that's kind of the bigger picture here. So now when we go into the specific events that started this whole conflict off, we're going to look at the October 7th terrorist attack. Things begin to get fishy. So I'm going to play two clips from Eric Weinstein from a recent podcast of his, and he's going to talk about some of the problems with the original attack and how we're being asked to believe something that doesn't seem plausible in terms of that this attack could be a surprise, that Israel and more importantly the U.S. didn't know about it, and it seems like they let it happen. Warning signs were ignored. You're seeing a lot of trends here that are reminiscent of the 9/11 attacks here in America, when similar warnings and signs were seemingly deliberately ignored to let the terrorist attack happen to justify this larger war in the Middle East. So this could be a repeat situation here. So let's hear what he has to say.
Why was arguably the most defended border on earth undefended on the anniversary of a historical attack on Israel, the Yom Kippur War, to the extent that Hamas was able to breach that border in many places simultaneously and bring a large force into the country that operated nearly unopposed for many, many hours. This was such a failure that one has to bend over backwards to rescue the idea that it was organic. Then the question is, has something gotten into the Israeli system that is ready to sacrifice civilians for some other purpose that has not been named and we do not know? So we are left with a paradox, which is behavior that appears to extend beyond incompetence, which is the exact pattern that we saw during COVID. It was behaviors that are still being dismissed as incompetent, but can't be incompetent because it's not plausible. That level of incompetence is implausible. The U.S. didn't notice Hamas for a year practicing and building for this operation. Nobody noticed. And now they're telling us that they are surgically attacking the installations that Hamas uses to conduct its operations. We know where those things are, but we didn't know that there was an operation being planned, and they pulled the force off the border and crossed their fingers on the anniversary of the Yom Kippur War. It is the lack of curiosity about the oddness of that pattern that really tells the story, I suspect.
Exactly. And that's the same thing with 9/11. The lack of curiosity of the government to get into all the problems with that official story, tells you that, this is part of an operation. So with this in mind, let's assume that the Hamas attack was not only allowed to happen, but also when you go deeper into who is Hamas and, similar to like what is Al-Qaeda, what is Muslim Brotherhood, you discover these things are assets of empire and they're used for these destabilizing purposes. And, furthermore, Hamas seems to be, the way I've heard people talk about it, it's sort of abstract in the sense that it's a blanket name with many different groups under it. And that's the kind of situation where you could bring in a group from Syria or whatever and embed them in this unit that is moving out, breaking the fences and moving into Israel to do whatever operation they're going to be doing. And that these outside groups can come in and perform these extreme atrocities, and you can blame the thing on Hamas. So it's a situation where it's sort of like we're acting like Hamas is this organized group where it seems that the way I've heard people talk about it, it seems to be more decentralized, and that decentralization creates the perfect breeding ground in order to commit a false flag, essentially, where you have a mercenary group go in, do a bunch of activities, and you brand it Hamas. I'm not saying that it explains all of what happened, but it does kind of make sense of the fact that even though there was a few military targets targeted by the insurgents on October 7th, there was nothing of like critical strategic importance. So the idea that you have a 2-year planned attack and all this training and stuff just to kill a bunch of civilians and take a couple hostages, it's not really plausible or believable that not only a terrorist group would spend so much time and energy to do something that has the potential for so much blowback as we're seeing now. Like, this could be your one and only operation you ever get to do if you're going to do a large scale thing. So just to kill people and take hostages, it doesn't make sense that you would bet the farm on that. But also, Hamas can't be a self-sustaining thing. Like, the Gaza Strip is not a self-sustaining area. It's dependent on the control of resources moving into Gaza in order to feed the people and give it energy and all that stuff, which is why it was so easy to cut all that off once the Israel counter-responsive came about. So the Hamas terrorist organization has to have outside funding. A lot of people are saying, oh, it's Iran or whatever. But it could also be American intelligence agencies funneling resources and manpower into this Hamas organization in order to get it to do an operation that it wants, because it's planning out these next stages that are to come afterwards, same as 9/11. So let's go back to Colonel MacGregor now, and he's going to, in analyzing this larger situation now that the terrorist attack has happened, and now that this massive counter response in Gaza, in terms of carpet bombing Gaza, killing all these civilians, it seems that all along, maybe the whole point behind all of this is that the U.S. wants a global war, or at least a regional war, or wants to draw Russia in. So let's hear what he has to say about it.
Collective punishment that involves 2.2 million people is not a very popular way to do business. The whole region is seething with anger over the attacks on the civilians in Gaza. This is the catalyst for a regional war. And the Iranians have said it. The Turks have said it. Everyone has said this is unacceptable. They've united the opposition, and we're helping them to do it over and over and over again every day. And this is an impasse because we have a full court press in the United States to emphasize why we should be doing this, why we should be co-belligerents with Israel. And that's effectively what we're becoming in a very real sense. And that puts us at risk of confrontation with Iran, with the Turks, and with Russia.
And so the question is, so we had the terrorist attack. Maybe it was allowed to happen. I presume that it was. Maybe it was even orchestrated to happen. Now you have the counter response. And so the counter response is now also drawing problems, because what is Israel's strategic aim? When you just say, oh, they hate the Palestinians and they want to ethnic cleanse, I think that there are in the Israeli government, in the IDF, in the Mossad, there are lots of people of that mindset, because they would have been selected. An environment where the U.S. is supporting an extremist government in Israel, you're going to have a natural selection process whereby the most extreme type of ideologues are going to be promoted and moved up in government. And so maybe there is a big constituency in the Israeli government that wants to ethnically cleanse Gaza and the West Bank of Palestinians and make it a pure Jewish state. But from the U.S. standpoint, that hardliner thing makes it impossible for this Israeli state to make peace with its neighbors, and that creates instability. So let's look at this Gaza situation. So Israel is carpet bombing Gaza. It's turning the whole thing into rubble, but it's also not letting the citizens leave. It's also shutting off food and resources, so that energy, sewage, water, so that many more thousands will die, in the near future, not even necessarily directly from bombings, but could be from starvation or disease or whatever. And so it's really like a hell on earth there. People are trapped. So what this does is that there is, through social media, everyday nonstop coverage of what it's like for the people in Gaza and all these dead children and women and innocents. And so what this is doing is this is breeding this hatred towards Israel and the U.S. And so this hatred is seemingly fostering a counter response. So now we have the idea of a terrorist attack with a planned counter response by Israel to be extreme, with the idea that that'll plan a larger counter response in the Islamic region to create this war, which will draw Russia in, as we'll see. So anyway, he's going to talk about this idea that the U.S., maybe through the Israeli state, is trying to create this hatred towards Israel to draw these outside Islamic countries to attack Israel in order to stop this nonstop assault on Gaza. But let's hear what he has to say.
And as Americans see more destruction and more film footage and photographs come out of Gaza showing children, women, old men dying, being killed, the support for Israel is going to erode. And at the same time, the anger and hatred inside the region, which already dislikes Israel, is going to be phenomenal. So Israel is doing something that I think no one has ever accomplished, at least not in my lifetime, and that is uniting Sunni and Shia against itself. That's why I think we have an obligation to save Israel from itself. But that's not a popular position. Right now, it's bombs away and everyone is cheering.
Okay, so it seems that this perhaps is the intended response, this outrage. It seems very unlikely to me that the social media outpouring of sympathy towards the Palestinians and anger towards the Israeli state, that this would not also be part of the operation. Maybe not for the Israelis, because they're the ones who are going to be attacked. You know, maybe these hardliners really are blinded and they can't see clearly, but for U.S. intelligence and Washington and the Pentagon, you know, this could be the exact thing that you want, because they're trying to draw on a regional war. Now, we can speculate about why they want a large war in Ukraine. They deliberately fostered that to draw Russia in. Why they could be doing the same thing in the Middle East. Why does this military industrial complex want forever war? We can talk about that. But it seems in this case, that is what they want. It's that simple. And so could Israel, with their policies here, with what they're doing in Gaza, could this lead ultimately to Israel committing suicide? Could the Israeli state be destroyed and be set up for destruction by the U.S. by creating this situation? Because what Israel's doing is destroying its own security. By being so punitive, they are creating a condition whereby their own state could succumb. And there's a lot of internal dissent within Israel as well. You know, I've heard people say that it was on the brink of civil war, you know, only months ago, and sort of large protests and revolts against the government. So is this government leading Israel to self-destruction? So that seems to be what's going on. In this next clip, he's going to be discussing how the steps that this situation in Gaza could escalate to lead towards a larger regional war or even a world war potentially. So let's hear what he has to say.
The Egyptians are now in a very difficult position. Under great pressure from public opinion in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, they may have to engage the Israelis because no one will protect the population in Gaza. That's a terrible, terrible possibility, one that we don't want, because if that happens to Egypt and Hezbollah attacks from the north, that will bring in everyone else. And we're suddenly confronting a war on a regional level that is going to harm us economically, physically in many ways, but could threaten the very existence of Israel. What's most important, I think, for Americans to understand is if we attack Iran on the basis of Hezbollah's alleged willingness to attack Israel if Israel invades Gaza, we will end up in a fight with Russia. And once Russia enters this, it becomes much more than just a local conflict.
So that's the path towards a global conflict, or at least a large-scale regional conflict, which could threaten the existence of the Israeli state, as he was mentioning. So in this next clip, which is from the Redacted program, his interview on there, he's going to talk about how Israel could potentially become the next Ukraine. And I've already tried to draw a link between these two, because it seems like in both cases, the U.S. is drawing a larger conflict and using a foreign nation as a site to wage this sort of proxy war battle. So, you know, it's fairly clear that Ukraine is a proxy war, but I think we should start to understand that what's happening in Israel could also be a sort of stage 2 of this proxy war that the U.S. is fighting against various groups for reasons that really aren't clear, but it does seem that the U.S. empire is undergoing a phase change. But I'll get into that a little bit towards the end of the video.
You write in your piece that Israel could become the next Ukraine if we don't watch out. How do you mean?
Well, first of all, Hezbollah that sits up in the north is not simply backed by Iran, but we estimate they have 100 to 150,000 of their own fighters. Plus, some estimates are between 130,000 and 140,000 rockets and missiles. Now, there's enough armament in Hezbollah to destroy half of Israel. Hezbollah has made it clear that if, in fact, the Israelis march into Gaza, this is the catalyst for a regional war. Keep in mind that the Israeli Defense Force on the ground consists of a small portion of professional soldiers. The vast majority of people that are being mobilized are simply civilians. They're reservists. Now, I've been told that these reservists are not nearly as well trained and prepared as their predecessors were in 1973.
So, he was kind of alluding to the idea that the Israeli military is highly touted. Their intelligence services are highly touted because they're given so much support by the U.S. And that's one of the things that makes the original October 7th attack hard to believe. But what he's talking about in this video and in the next clip coming up is how, the states surrounding Israel aren't in the same condition they were the last time there was major conflict between Israel and these foreign states. So Israel's not in such a good position here. And he also mentions how the Israeli army is also not in a strong position to fight potentially numerous different fronts at once. So he's going to talk more in this next clip about what the U.S. / Israel is facing with this larger regional war that the U.S. seems to want. But this is the sort of state of play of what they're up against.
And I think we're grossly underestimating the military potential of those lining up against Israel. People don't seem to understand that today's Middle East is radically different from the Middle East of 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. Today, the Arab states are far more, I would argue, cohesive. The governments are stronger. They have more technology at their disposal, and there's a greater willingness to weigh in collectively. And today, we're also talking about Turkey and Iran as playing a major role, and as a result, Russia. Russia cannot sit idly by if Iran ends up being attacked by us. It will feel obligated to intervene because the Iranians have supported the Russians against the Ukrainian proxies. So this has the ingredients in it for a very major war. Now, we're escalating across the boards. We seem to think that escalation works.
So that's the situation right now in Israel. In this next clip, we're going to be looking at some of the bigger picture implications and trying to tie it in with what might be going on in U.S. empire. And one of them is this idea that it seems like initially with the Ukraine war and Russia, and now also with the situation in the Middle East, particularly the fact that there's so many hardliners in the U.S. that want war with Iran, this type of conflict, both of these are perfectly tailored to destabilize the global energy markets. I mean, Ukraine war initially had a big effect on that and it's kind of mellowed out. But then if you add this situation here and you start messing with Iran, that could really throw a kink in not only the global oil trade and the price of fuel and energy, which has implications for the economics and the financial system, but also the petrodollar order. And at the same time, it's like the U.S. is deliberately trying to start these wars and maybe trying to manipulate this legacy system. So it seems to me that the U.S. the way it's behaving is it's getting ready to abandon that older system. And it has plans for something new. And if you go back and look at my archive, particularly my whole series on the secret history of the 20th century, you'll discover a discussion about this whole alternate paradigm of energy and technology that's been developed since, the mid to late 1800s. And that has been classified and is the most secret thing in the world, this different paradigm. So my feeling is that the fact that the UFO situation is now being discussed, going alongside these current events, is prefacing this move out of this old energy order and also this financial and economic paradigm that was associated with it and into a new energy paradigm. And I feel like the U.S. is setting the stage for this move quietly. And these events in the world are sort of part of the abandonment of this older legacy system of U.S. empire. That's my feeling, and I'll go into that more in future episodes. But in this next clip, Colonel MacGregor is going to be discussing the idea that perhaps the U.S. is trying to create an energy crisis through these Ukraine and Israel conflicts.
Do you think that we are moving toward war with Iran?
Yes, I do. And it looks like the chosen destination is indeed Armageddon. There doesn't seem to be any real appreciation for the implications for us and frankly, for Europe and the world, as well as the Middle East, of such action. You know, take for an example, just on the economic side, about 20% of the world's oil passes through the Straits of Hormuz every month. Now we're looking at potentially scarcity. We've drained our strategic oil reserve for all intents and purposes. If the Strait of Hormuz is shut down, if the Suez Canal is closed, we're in a lot of trouble in the short run, that's for sure. How rapidly can we recover from all of this? How many refineries can we put back into operation? How much drilling can we do quickly? The answer is not very much. So draining that strategic oil reserve was a very serious mistake.
So, like we said, the U.S. deliberately drains its strategic oil reserves and then deliberately tries to start these conflicts that's going to destabilize the energy markets and set the stage for a crisis financially, economically, and in terms of energy. This is deliberate. And so clearly, I feel like it's moving away from an older model into a new model that's going to be, you know, digital, CBDC, new energy paradigm, perhaps a more formal global system of government. These are the things I think that are being suggested that we're moving into, that current events are promoting this shift. So that's how I'm reading the situation right now. And so in this last clip is going to tie in something that I've been kind of curious about for a while. I'm sure many people have, which is the open border policy, the unofficial open border policy that the U.S. has had, basically going out of its way to allow any and everybody who wants to come through the southern border to come in the United States, including any number of cartel groups, human trafficking groups, drug groups, you know, bringing fentanyl and things in. Like, why would we want to destabilize our own country? Why would we want to make ourselves so vulnerable by doing this? So clearly there is an agenda here. What is the reason to create this open border, which is basically sowing instability deliberately in the U.S.? And now when we look at this idea of radicalizing the entire Islamic world and turning it against not only Israel, but the U.S. for backing Israel as part of a deliberately created war in the Middle East, now it's like, you know, is the open border policy partly to do with the desire to bring in all these terrorist cells potentially into the U.S. and then cause a war in the Middle East so that these get activated and sow chaos at home? So if you sow chaos at home, what does that mean? It means that the populace is now going to want to embrace digital security system, digital ID systems, things that, you know, in China, they've already implemented and embraced, but people in the West have been very resistant to embrace these things for good reason. And so does creating chaos and terrorism at home create a condition where the populace is going to be begging for security measures and full ID measures in the way that they were rejecting them or not wanting them so much a couple years now after the COVID crisis? Because COVID very much seemed like, oh, it was also part of a digital ID system that they were trying to implement. So is this phase 2 of that global ID system initiative? And does this whole open border thing, these terrorist cells, the war in the Middle East, are these coming together to maybe create a new type of planned catastrophe in order to set the stage for the embrace of these new platforms and this new model of governance, which is now going to be based on controlling, you know, your digital ID and your central bank digital currency? And you can kind of now regulate people's actions and behaviors based on those things. So in this last clip, he's going to talk about the potential for terrorism and blowback in the U.S. as a result of this war that the U.S. is deliberately trying to foster in the Middle East.
What about the concerns about terrorism in the United States?
Well, I think they're very valid. Yeah, I think these concerns are very, very valid. We've had open borders now for the last 2.5 years, but we've had an illegal migration problem for the last 3+ decades. We don't know who's in the country. We really don't. The Europeans face something quite similar. They were bullied into admitting millions of Muslims from the Middle East and Africa. We've been bullied by our government to open the borders and let in effectively anybody who wants to come. So we don't know who's here, but we do know that Hamas, as well as Hezbollah, have positions in Mexico. So we have to expect that once Hezbollah is in the war and we are against them and Iran, that much of our infrastructure will be at risk. Something as bad or potentially even worse than 9/11 could happen here.
So that's the end of the clips. I mean, that was the kind of meat and potatoes of Colonel MacGregor's recent appearances on the Redacted program and on the Tucker Carlson program. And I thought that this was the most clear and insightful analysis of what's going on and what kind of world that the U.S. is creating with these actions, both by supporting Israel and by its maneuvering in Ukraine. That it seems that it wants global war, but it's also setting the stage with all these other pieces that, global war would in turn have these other consequences, economic, financial, energy, and that these are the type of moves being positioned on the grand chessboard, and all these things are somehow tied in together. And clearly COVID is tied into this as well, the lockdowns and everything. Because what's interesting is that while we're fighting Russia and all these other countries and have combative relationships, in terms of the World Health Organization, the policy, there's integration. So, on a political level and a military level, there's these conflicts, but on a bureaucratic level, particularly through the health programs but also like commerce, economics, finance, there's all these linkages between these countries, and there's all kinds of business, and culturally we're all being interconnected together. So this division and splitting of people is really on the superficial level, but that doesn't make it any less real in terms of the number of deaths. There's this like dissonance, cognitive dissonance, where it's like on one hand we're very much moving towards a world nation, a world culture, world society. There's now a flow of information and knowledge and culture between people. And at the same time, these artificial boundaries that are due to politics and military and things like that, these are trying to deliberately keep this competitive psychology alive so that we'll be fighting with each other when there's all these other trends that are bringing us together. And so this is the time that we're in, where these two poles, one's towards, globalism and one's towards a fallback into competition and sort of nation states trying to express their supremacy and right to control and rule. And so this is the interesting time that we're living in. This is a very important time in human history and human evolution. And these are themes I talk about in a more philosophic light in a lot of my videos. For example, talking about the idea of the Kali Yuga and how that might be coming to an end and these sort of world ages and things like that. So if you're interested in these bigger picture ideas, particularly if you want to know the whole backstory of what's going on in the world and sort of the main narrative of U.S. empire, go back and look at my Secret History of the 20th Century series, and even my series on Manly Hall, because I look at some of these current events from a philosophic perspective in that series. So that's all I have for today. Thanks for listening, and I will be keeping on top of these events and be coming back with more analysis as we proceed. And then I have another series coming up, which is actually called The 21st Century of Prophecy. And that's my last big series for a while. And by series, it's really a book. It's got multiple parts, and it'll come together, and I'll eventually do a print edition like I'm going to be doing it with all my past series that I've done. These are all books, really, but they all come together. And so this next series is going to be called The 21st Century of Prophecy, and I'm going to be going into an astrological diagnosis of the time period and the themes as put forth by Manly Hall. I'm going to be analyzing some of his material. And then I'm going to be taking those themes and that basically the astrological diagnosis of the time period that we're in. And then I'm going to be investigating the different elements of it. So I'm going to be talking about the fight with the shadow, which is very much what I feel like this period of time represents. On a psychological level, in mass, both individually and collectively, we're being confronted with our shadow. And through this confrontation with the shadow, you confront things within yourself that you're projecting onto others. Ultimately, it brings you to equilibrium, this confrontation with the shadow. It's a part of your evolutionary growth process. So this is a fight with the shadow in mass, but on an individual level as well. And that's one of the prominent themes. And this idea of an energy revolution and a new paradigm of energy coming forward, that's also one of these themes that we're moving into and suggested by astrology. So this is all coming up that I'll be getting into in that last series. But until then, I'm going to be coming back and giving some more insight and analysis on the current goings on in the world. So please stay tuned, and God bless. Thank you very much.